Hey guys, super excited today to be here in the studio to record this video for you where I first introduce LRTimelapse 6. I've been really working for months and years on this new version and I couldn't tell before, but today is the day. So stay tuned to see what's new in LRTimelapse 6, and it's quite a lot and it's really exciting things for time-lapse photographers. First of all, again, I managed to realize a quite massive increase in speed and performance of LRTimelapse, of the whole workflow. This affects the basic folder loading, it affects the camera preview generation. Also, I have native support for the new Mac Silicon architecture, which means that LRTimelapse is not going to run in the Rosetta emulation anymore on a Mac Silicon, but it will run natively, which increases the speed. I will show you that. Also for the long-term time-lapse filters, they are much faster now. What I did is to parallelize even more of the processes in LRTimelapse to make them multi-threaded. So the more processing cores your computer offers, the faster everything will be. And then, of course, if you additionally use a fast SSD, then it will really rock and roll and you won't be waiting for the tasks anymore when editing your time lapses. Let's have a look at some comparisons. First of all, let's have a look at the process of loading a fresh sequence into the old LRTimelapse 5 and in parallel into LRTimelapse 6. And you can see that massive speed improvement between the two versions, where LRTimelapse 6 is already finished when LRTimelapse 5 has barely reached half of the process. And now let's compare how LRTimelapse runs in native Mac Silicon mode versus the Rosetta emulation. This is both on 6, but it compares the regular version with the Silicon version. For you, it is quite easy. If you have a Mac Silicon, just download the LRTimelapse installer for Mac Silicon, install it, and you're good to go. Any additional tools like the video encoder will automatically be switched to the Silicon version also, and the Adobe DNG converter will also automatically install in a Silicon version if you have the latest version installed. So the next thing that you will instantly notice when you open LRTimelapse 6 is that you have that new direct editing panel with the tools that you know from Lightroom. Let's have a look. This is the new user interface in LRTimelapse 6. It's not the big difference from version 5, but you will instantly see that editing panel here on the right. And by the way, in this tutorial, I will only show you the differences between LRTimelapse 5 and LRTimelapse 6. If you're not a LRTimelapse user yet, please have a look at my basic tutorials on LRTimelapse.com/tutorial, where I explain everything. Currently, they are for LRTimelapse 5, but I'll be publishing new tutorials in the next weeks and months specifically for LRTimelapse 6. But for now, you can watch the old tutorials. The changes are not so big in terms of the workflow. And in this video here, I will only focus on the differences to version 6. First of all, I'm going to load a sequence that has been straight from camera. It's unedited. You can see how fast the sequence loads. Now we will do the regular workflow. Start with the keyframes wizard, create 3 keyframes in this case, and then save. What happens now is LRTimelapse switches to visual previews automatically in a special mode that is indicated here by those 2 keyframes, which means that it will generate visual previews only for those keyframes. And also you will see that small overlay here, which will make you aware of the fact that the visual previews generation, it's not doing all frames, it's just doing the keyframes. And this is quite handy because now you can edit your keyframes here in a simple way. For example, do some exposure tweaks. You will instantly see the results here in the preview. So let's do some simple editing. Now I can also switch the white balance from the S-shot value that comes from the camera to a custom value, and then set my temperature and tint. And now I can sync my settings to the next keyframe, as you're used to do it in Lightroom with the sync script. So now that we are on the second keyframe, we can just do some smaller modifications and then synchronize everything to the last keyframe. Change the exposure a little bit, to a little bit down, change the temperature. Okay, quite rough, but it should be enough to get the point. So now let's do the auto transition. And what happens here automatically is that LRTimelapse sets the mode of the preview generation to generate the visual previews now for all images. So that little overlay here has vanished, and you can see it, the different icon here. And this means now the preview generation will get started for all the images, because we calculated the auto transition and we are now in the mode where we would like to have all visual previews developed for the deflickering afterwards. Another thing you might have noticed already is that I've streamlined the workflows. It's only two workflow tabs left here, the visual workflow and the old basic or JPEG workflow, which normally you wouldn't use that much. In 99.9% of all cases, we would be using the visual workflow. And what I removed was the long-term workflow, because the only difference was the filter. And the filter is now here on the visual workflow as well. Another thing that I changed is that I put the reload button here to the right. Before it used to be here, but since now when we come back from Lightroom and do the auto transition, it will be automatically reloading the metadata for the keyframes. So we don't need the reload here anymore. And so we have it here just in case that you need to reload the metadata for the whole sequence. The basic JPEG workflow is basically the same that it has been since LRTimelapse 3. Normally you wouldn't be using it. It's only if you want to do a JPEG editing directly in LRTimelapse, but you won't have the visual previews and visual deflicker and so on. So what I recommend in those cases is to convert the JPEG sequences to DNG in Lightroom. If you ever come to the situation where you would like to use JPEGs, just think in converting them to DNG, and then you can use the visual workflow. And another thing that I removed was the video workflow, because the only difference to the basic workflow was that we had a button for video import, but that video importer is here nevertheless in the import dialog. So you just go to import from video file and then you select your video files and you get a JPEG sequence. It's also something that is not really used very frequently. So I thought removing it wouldn't do any harm. What I really like on the new version also is the new improved folder management. We now have ratings for folders, which makes it much easier when just working with a big bunch of folders to just keep track of them. Then we also will have a preview when hovering over the folders, and we'll be able to restrict the usage of folders in LRTimelapse to certain time-lapse folders. When you're working with lots of folders, then it has been quite hard to keep track of them just by the file names. That's why now when you hover over one of those folders, you will see one image from the folder as overlay, and you can instantly see which sequence that is. Additionally to that, you can now set ratings for those folders here. For example, star rating, or this trash can rating, or 2 stars, or thumbs up, or a question mark. With the right mouse, you can set the folder rating here to one of those choices. It's even easier to just hover over the folder and then press Ctrl 2, 3, 4, 5, and then just change the rating of that folder. Another thing that I find quite handy is that I can now restrict LRTimelapse from using all the folders here on my hard drives and network drives and everything. So I just can go to Edit, Settings, and then Folders, and say Restrict Folders tree to certain folders. And then I can just add some folders here. For example, those two here, Timelapse Done and Timelapse Original. that I've already added, and now say OK. We'll now have to restart LRTimelapse once. Now that we are back, we have our two parent folders here, the original and the timelapse done folder, and only those. What's important when you restrict folders is that you add every parent folder that you would like to use in LRTimelapse for the different purposes. For original time lapses, for the intermediary sequences, and also card readers, etc. In order to be able to access your card reader later from the import dialog, you would need to mount it once to the computer so that it's accessible, then add it to that list of folders, and then from then on it will always be available in LRTimelapse. And this feature to restrict to folders is specifically useful when you have a big system with lots of attached drives and so on, and the startup then might take quite long to rescan all the folders. And so with this new feature you can just restrict everything to your timelapse working folders and be more organized and quicker in finding your stuff in LRTimelapse. Another feature request which came from the long-term time-lapse photographers was to be able to filter for days of the week. For example, to be able to just filter out images that have been shot on weekends, because they're usually on construction sites, there is no work at all happening there. And now in the filter panel in LRTimelapse Pro, you also have the option to select which weekdays you would like to have included and which should be filtered out. And then another area where I've been working a lot on is the rendering. One thing is now we'll have an option of internal exporting and rendering directly in LRTimelapse with a couple of things to consider. We'll come to that next. Then we will have render presets, which also was a feature request from the community, which I heard often, to just be able to save some presets for the different render settings. And now we can also work with multiple aspect ratios. Let's have a look. Every LRTimelapse 5 user will instantly recognize this dialog. Which changed is now this section here for the presets, where you can instantly access different sets of render settings here and just change them with one click. Those are default presets here. For example, for a default full HD rendering that would be accepted by nearly every player. This one will just set MP4, 1080p, medium quality, and so on. Then we'll have another one here for production UHD, for example, which would render in ProRes in 4K UHD. Let's say you would like to change the quality here to high and save that preset. You just click here on update, and now the preset just have been updated. And you can also just add additional presets here. Say you would like to render in H.265 in 6K and high quality and so on. Then you just choose a preset name, for example, and then you add this, and then you have your new preset here. So it's quite easy and will make your life hopefully a little bit easier when working with LRTimelapse 6. The next thing that we have here is the different aspect ratios. Formerly you could only choose to force an aspect ratio of 16:9. Now you have different aspect ratios, 2:1, or even the portrait mode aspect ratios like 9:16 or 1:2 and so on. And you can also change the position. This cropping here will of course only affect the rendered videos, but of course not the exported intermediary files. But you know that the intermediary files are always the files that you can use to render different versions of the videos with different presets, different aspect ratios, and so on. And now we have another option here, which is called export and render current sequence. Currently it's not active. Of course, that's because we didn't load a sequence before. So let's do that. The workflow here indicates that you can either export and render in Lightroom or use the direct export and render internally now here in LRTimelapse. So now that we opened the dialog and have a sequence loaded in LRTimelapse, we can also have this activated export and render current sequence. Now let's just set this to 16:9. So what happens now is you get a warning here, and that's important, that those exported sequences that we export directly from LRTimelapse without going to Lightroom, they will always be JPEG, they will be only 8-bit, and they will be Rec 709 color space. The quality is a bit more limited than what you get if you go through Lightroom. But it's a quick way to just export your sequence and render it in one pass. So let's do that. I will just do export and render. And this has now put the task here in my batch task list. We'll now, in the first instance, export the intermediary sequence, and then in the second instance, do the rendering as you know it. So this direct export and render is quite handy, but always be aware that the original workflow that I show in all the other tutorials, where you go to Lightroom and come back to LRTimelapse, has a couple of advantages in terms of quality, in terms of batch abilities. For example, there you can just select a bunch of prepared time-lapse folders and then just have a batch export. So there's a couple of advantages, but with LRTimelapse 6 you have both options. You can do the internal way, if you know about the limitations, and you can do the external way, which for skilled time-lapse photographers is not really slower than this way. So now you have both options. And the same goes for the internal editor. Of course, you have way more options in Lightroom than you have here, but for some quick re-editing, for example, if you decide that the second keyframe just should be a little bit brighter, then you can just easily change that here without having to go back and forth and then just do a new auto transition and have LRTimelapse recalculate the sequence without having to go to Lightroom, save metadata, read metadata, and so on. The combination of those two approaches, I think that's what makes LRTimelapse 6 so powerful. So those are the most important areas where LRTimelapse 6 has been improved over the former version. But of course, there's more smaller things, like the deflicker parameters are now being remembered. For example, if you're used to use a 4-pass multi-pass deflicker for every sequence, then LRTimelapse will now remember that setting and let you directly apply that to the next sequence. Also, another thing that I added is a constant option for the visual deflicker. For example, if you do stop motion, then you would like to have a constant level of luminosity through all the sequence. And now with the constant button, you can just set the deflicker to not follow the luminance. We'll just have a constant reference luminance. And another thing is that now also the 16-bit DNG files from the Lightroom HDR feature are directly supported in LRTimelapse. Those files have a exposure range from -10 to +10, as opposed to the normal exposure range of -5 to +5, and this is also now directly supported in LRTimelapse. Let's speak about licensing. Basically everything has stayed the same as it was with LRTimelapse 5. If you bought a LRTimelapse 5 license from 1st of October 2021, then it will work with LRTimelapse 6 out of the box. No need to do anything. If you have an older license, you would need to upgrade your license to the new version. If you have a private license, you can just buy the private upgrade, Or you could, if you decide to go to LRTimelapse Pro with all the advantages, then you could buy the cross-grade from private to pro. Or if you have a pro license already, then you can just do the pro upgrade. And of course, there's still a free version. The main limitation of the free version is that it will only accept sequences of up to 400 images, and it will only let you render in full HD. So it's basically for testing the software. And if you like the software, I would really appreciate if you buy a license to support my work. I kept the prices of all licenses and upgrades the same as they are since nearly 10 years now. I hope you appreciate this. Also, let me say that major LRTimelapse upgrades usually came every 2 years. This time it's already 4 years since I released LRTimelapse 5. This is not because I have been lazy, that's because I didn't want to release a paid upgrade 2 years ago when we were in the start of the pandemic, and that's why at that time I released LRTimelapse 5.5, which was a major upgrade for free, and now 2 years later this is time for the paid upgrade to LRTimelapse 6. I hope you understand that and you will support me by buying the upgrade. I hope you will like to work with LRTimelapse 6 as much as I do. I've been doing a lot with the new version already when testing, and I really cannot imagine working without those new features anymore. Let me know what you think about the new features. Let me know if you have any ideas for new improvements. Join me in the forum where we can discuss all those topics. See you next time. Bye bye.